Before this story continues, allow me to clarify one important thing. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes. It explores toxic family dynamics and their emotional impact within the context of military life and U.S. military families. All characters, ranks, units, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not refer to, or imply any real individuals, units, or organizations within the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard. This content may be supported by AI tools during the creative process. This story does not depict real events, does not disclose military information, and does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. It is told with respect for the core values of the United States military, including honor, discipline, responsibility, and human dignity. The content is designed to be advertiser-friendly, compliant with YouTube community guidelines, and does not seek to distort or misrepresent the image of American service members or the military. If you are a woman who has stood quietly behind a military family, who has carried more than anyone noticed, who has stayed silent when it would have been easier to speak, stay until the end. And if this story reaches you, share your thoughts in the comments, or follow the channel to continue walking alongside stories made for strong hearts that are rarely heard. My name is Kaya Hale. I am 27 years old, and in November of 2023, 1 week after Veterans Day, I stood in a small funeral hall near Temple, Texas, close enough to Fort Cavazos that you could feel the weight of military history in the room without anyone needing to say it out loud. Around me were folded flags, wooden benches, men with stiff backs and old jackets, and the smell of cheap coffee that always seems to appear at places where people are expected to grieve quietly. I was active duty at the time, working joint operations and logistics liaison, which is the kind of job people outside the system think is boring, and people inside the system know is where decisions actually happen. My grandfather, Robert Hale, had served in logistics decades earlier and lived his life the same way even after retirement. Measured, disciplined, exact. He taught me early that systems matter more than speeches, and that timing is often more powerful than noise. My parents, Frank and Diane Hale, sat in the front row that day, polished, solemn, and already thinking 3 steps ahead in the way people do when money is involved. My brother Ethan sat beside them, relaxed, confident, the golden child who always landed on his feet no matter how hard he fell. In Texas, people cry less than they count, and as the service ended and the chairs scraped back, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, not just from losing my grandfather but from knowing what came next. It did not take long. Before the hall even emptied, my mother touched my arm and pressed a thin stack of papers into my hand. Her voice was low, sharp, and efficient. "Since you are here, you might as well be useful. You are good with paperwork. Do not make us look bad." That sentence landed heavier than the flag presentation had. In the small meeting room off the hall, the lawyer began reading the will. My father received controlling assets. My mother received funds and land tied to the estate. Ethan was named to manage operations. Each name was met with nods, murmurs, even congratulations. When it was my turn, the lawyer hesitated just long enough for the room to notice, then handed me a single thin envelope. My mother laughed, not quietly, not kindly. Right there in front of men who had served with my grandfather, she said, "Maybe he left you a lesson about knowing your place." Ethan added with a half smile, "Do not worry, you still have the military. That paycheck covers gas at least." I felt eyes shift toward me, then away. Someone behind me sighed. An older veteran who had known my grandfather whispered Robert would have hated this, but he did not say it loud enough to stop anything. I did not cry. I did not argue. I felt something colder move through me. Not grief, not anger. Recognition. I had seen this before in briefings when people thought a decision was already made and stopped listening. I held the envelope and said nothing. I waited until I reached my car to open it under the dull parking lot lights, with my hands still smelling like sanitizer from the funeral hall. Inside was not money, not a letter, not an apology. It was an order, a movement directive with a specific time, a specific location, and a verification code. Tucked behind it was a small handwritten note in my grandfather's careful block letters. "Use the authority I taught you. That was it. No explanation, no comfort, no signature flourish. In that moment, I understood something my family never would. My grandfather had not given me something to show. He had given me something to activate. As my phone buzzed with messages from my mother reminding me to scan documents and from my father warning me not to cause gossip, I sat there and let the silence settle. I thought about everything my grandfather had taught me without ever calling it a lesson. How systems answer when people do not. How silence is not weakness when it is chosen. I folded the order back into the envelope and said one word out loud. Okay, if you have ever been turned into unpaid help on the worst day of your life, stay with me until the end. The truth is, my family had been practicing this long before my grandfather died. The funeral just stripped away the last bit of politeness. For 6 or 7 years before that day, they had learned how to say the right things in public and the wrong things in private, and never confuse the two. When I enlisted, they told everyone they knew that their daughter served her country. They said it at church. They said it at neighborhood cookouts. They said it with pride, the way people say something that reflects well on them. But when the phone rang at night because my car needed repairs, or because housing paperwork fell apart, or because I needed help navigating a move, they all said the same thing. You chose this. You are tough. You will figure it out. When Ethan launched his first business idea and it collapsed in under a year, my parents called it bad timing. When the second one failed, they called it a learning experience. They loaned him money without paperwork and never mentioned it again. When I asked for help with a short-term expense, they asked why I did not plan better. When Ethan needed introductions, they made calls. When I needed a signature, they told me to wait. They called it trust. They called me rigid. They liked to say I was stubborn, as if discipline were a flaw when it did not benefit them. They liked to say Ethan was creative even when creativity cost other people money. That pattern did not change after the funeral. It intensified. Within hours of leaving the cemetery, my phone started filling with messages that did not ask how I was doing or whether I had made it home safely. My mother texted first. Can you scan the estate documents tonight? You are good with that stuff. My father followed. Do not talk to anyone about what happened today. We do not need gossip. Ethan added a laughing emoji and said, Welcome to admin duty. Government job, perks right. I sat in my car with the engine off and watched the dashboard clock tick forward 1 minute at a time. The shock of the morning had settled into something heavier. Not anger yet. Pressure. The kind that builds when people assume your availability because they have already decided your place. That evening they gathered at my parents' house as if nothing had happened. Relatives filled the living room and kitchen talking about assets and next steps and timelines. My mother handed me a stack of folders before I could sit down. You can start organizing these. You do not have kids and you work for the government, so you have time. She said it casually as if it were a compliment. My father nodded in agreement and said loud enough for everyone to hear she is good at following instructions. She does well when someone tells her exactly what to do. A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was easier than challenging him. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice neutral. I took the folders and sat at the end of the table. I watched how decisions were made around me without me. Ethan paced with his phone in his hand, talking about restructuring and leadership and vision. He said words he had heard other people use before. When someone asked him a specific question about operations, he looked at my father. My father answered for him. When I asked a question about timelines, my mother said, "We will handle that. You just make sure everything is scanned correctly." Ethan noticed me watching him and smiled. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Do you ever get tired of being on edge all the time? I mean, I hear military life messes people up, always waiting for something bad to happen." PTSD jokes are funny to people who have never had to learn how to sleep lightly. He said it like a joke. Just light enough that if I reacted, he could accuse me of being sensitive. I did not react. I kept scanning papers. I could feel several pairs of eyes flick toward me and then away again. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the words, the confidence behind them, the certainty that I would absorb it and move on like I always had. Later, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen. Her voice dropped into that tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "You know your brother is under a lot of pressure right now. Try not to make things harder for him. You know how you can be." I asked her what she meant. She sighed and said, "You push back. You ask too many questions. Sometimes you forget that this is family, not the military." I thought about how often family had felt more demanding than any unit I had ever worked with. I nodded and said nothing. The next day my father asked me to come by again. He wanted me to witness a document for Ethan. It was an authorization that would give Ethan broad control over estate-related decisions. I read it carefully. When I asked a simple clarifying question about scope, my father frowned. "You do not need to overthink it. Ethan needs flexibility." My mother added, "You always do this. You slow things down." Ethan laughed and said, "See, this is why I could never do what you do. All that structure, all those rules." I smiled slightly and signed where they told me to sign. I watched relief spread across their faces. That relief was the confirmation I needed. They did not see me as a person with limits. They saw me as a function, something reliable and quiet that existed to support their momentum. That night, Ethan caught me alone on the porch and said, "You know I give you credit. I would not last a week doing what you do. All that discipline, all that waiting. You must get used to being told where to stand." I looked at him and thought about how often I had been told where to stand, and how rarely he had ever stayed there. I thought about my grandfather, and the way he used to say the hardest position to leave is the one people put you in without asking. I did not argue. I did not correct him. I let him believe what he wanted. Inside, something shifted. It was not rage. It was clarity. The most painful part was not their jokes or their assumptions. It was the fact that they truly believed I would never move beyond the role they had assigned me. They believed the table would always be set the same way. Have you ever had someone joke right into the place that hurt the most? If you have, comment, one word, scene. I opened the envelope sitting in my car under the dim yellow lights of the parking lot behind the funeral hall. The engine was off and the night had that quiet Texas stillness that comes after people have gone home, and only the hum of the highway remains. My hands still smelled faintly of sanitizer from the bathroom sink inside the hall, and the paper felt thinner than it should have for something that had just made my family laugh. Inside was not a check and not a letter explaining love in hindsight. It was a set of orders printed cleanly with a time window, a location, and a verification code that meant nothing to anyone outside the system and everything to someone inside it. Tucked behind the orders was a small card torn from a notebook with my grandfather's handwriting steady and familiar. "Use the authority I taught you." That was all. No signature, no date, no explanation. I sat there for a long minute staring at the words and listening to my phone vibrate with messages I did not open. This was not a will. It was not a consolation prize. It was a key, and my grandfather had handed it to me in the one place my family would never look for it. I folded the orders back into the envelope and placed it in the center console as if it were something fragile. On the drive home, I did not play music. I let the road noise and my own breathing fill the space. At home, I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and poured a glass of water. I did not open it again. I did not rush to understand it. My grandfather had never rushed anything that mattered. The next morning I read the news the way I always did. Not headlines, but the quiet updates buried beneath them. A schedule adjustment for a meeting most people did not know existed. A change in operational priority that would not make the evening news. Small things that only registered if you knew where to look. One of those items aligned exactly with the time window printed on the orders. I felt my stomach tighten. Not with fear, but with confirmation. Later that day, I stepped outside my office and made a call to a number I had not used in years. I spoke for 10 seconds in a calm voice and said exactly what the orders required me to say. There was a pause on the other end, then a shift in tone. The person asked me to repeat the verification code, and when I did, they said understood and told me where to be. No questions, no small talk. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again. My mother. Tonight, come by and scan the rest of the files. You can eat with us. My father followed with a separate message. Do not make any decisions without talking to us first. We do not need people speculating. I left both unread and sat back at my desk. The day moved slowly. I worked through tasks that felt ordinary and kept my thoughts contained. In the afternoon, someone mentioned a name in passing during a meeting, a name my father had once referenced years ago as someone important but unreachable. I knew that name well enough to understand what it implied, and I said nothing. That evening, I drove to my parents' house because avoidance would have raised more questions than compliance. My mother handed me a scanner and pointed me toward the dining table without looking me in the eye. My father talked loudly about how quickly things were moving and how much responsibility Ethan would be carrying now. Ethan leaned against the counter and asked if the military had taught me how to alphabetize or if I had picked that up on my own. I smiled politely and kept scanning. Halfway through the stack, my phone vibrated again with a message that read simply, "Confirm." I typed, "Yes," and put the phone face down. My mother noticed and frowned. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Just work," I said. She nodded as if that explained everything. Later, my father said, "You know, people are watching how we handle this. We need to look united." He said it like a warning. Ethan added, "Do not do anything that makes us look bad." I thought about how often unity was demanded only when it protected someone else's position. When I left that night, my mother reminded me to come back the next day. "There is still more to scan," she said. I drove home and placed the envelope on the counter again. I read the orders once more slowly this time. The location was specific, the time was exact, the code was valid. My grandfather had always said that authority does not announce itself. It waits for the moment when noise has exhausted itself. The following morning, I received a message from someone I had not heard from in months, asking if I would be available later in the week. The phrasing was careful and respectful. I replied with a short confirmation and no explanation. At lunch, I overheard coworkers speculating about a change they could not quite name. I knew what it was and kept eating. On the drive home, my phone lit up again. My mother. "Can you come tonight? We need those files sent." My father. Remember what I said about gossip. Ethan. Do not disappear on us now. I parked and sat in the car with the engine idling. The pressure was building, but it was familiar. I had lived under pressure long enough to know when it was meant to force a mistake. I did not make one. I sent a brief message saying I would be unavailable. No reason given. Inside my apartment, I set my bag down and opened the envelope one last time. The orders were still there, unchanged. The note still said the same thing. Use the authority I taught you. I understood then why my grandfather had chosen the day of his funeral. He knew exactly who would show themselves and how. He knew that the contrast would sharpen the lesson. If you are guessing what was really inside that envelope, do not leave. You will understand why he chose that day. I executed the orders the same way I had been trained to execute everything else by the book, without drama and without asking for permission from anyone who was not authorized to give it. I verified my identification twice, once digitally and once in person. I arrived early because being early reduces variables. I waited where I was told to wait and spoke only when prompted. There was no red carpet and no acknowledgement beyond a nod from someone who checked my credentials and motioned me forward. The system did not celebrate me, and it did not need to. It simply functioned. Forms were reviewed, stamps were placed, times were logged, and access was granted in quiet, efficient steps that would look meaningless to an outsider and absolute to anyone who understood them. I signed where I was told to sign and confirmed what needed confirmation. When I left, no one thanked me and no one asked questions. That was how I knew it mattered. While the system moved forward, my family tightened around me like a vice. My father called first, asking me to stop by because there was something important to sign. His tone had shifted from managerial to urgent. When I arrived, he placed a document in front of me and said it would make things easier if I authorized Ethan to handle all matters related to the estate going forward. He used words like efficiency and unity and trust. I read the document slowly and asked one neutral question about scope. His jaw tightened. My mother cut in before he answered. "Do not do this right now," she said. "Do not make things harder. If you make trouble for your brother, do not expect to call this place home." The word home landed hard because it was meant to. Ethan leaned against the counter and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Do not think wearing a uniform makes people afraid," he said. "Out here it does not mean much." He said it casually as if it were advice. I felt the pressure spike, but I kept my posture relaxed. I told them I would review the document and get back to them. My father's voice rose a notch. "We do not have time for delays. People are watching." My mother folded her arms and said, "We raised you better than this." I nodded and left without signing. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with messages that stacked one on top of the other. "Where are you? We need this done. Do not make us look bad." Ethan sent a final message saying, "Do not force our hand." That one sat heavier than the rest. The next day, the pressure escalated again. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced and stood in the doorway looking past me as if evaluating a space she might soon control. She spoke in a low voice, meant to sound calm. "Families stick together," she said. "Do not embarrass us." I told her I had obligations and could not talk. She stepped closer and said, "Do not forget where you came from." I thought about the difference between origin and obligation and said nothing. That afternoon, Ethan called and asked me to meet him. He said we could talk like adults. When we sat down, he slid the same authorization across the table and said, "This protects everyone." I asked him why he needed it. He laughed and said, "Because you like rules and I like results." I pushed the paper back toward him and said I could not sign it. His smile disappeared. He leaned in and said, "You are not as important as you think. Do not test us." That was the moment I recognized how close they were to a mistake. When people believe control is slipping, they reach. They overreach. They forget process. At work, I continued to follow procedures. I confirmed appointments. I checked IDs. I waited when told to wait. There were small acknowledgments along the way, a change in how people addressed me, a pause before speaking, a brief confirmation that did not exist before. Nothing overt. Everything precise. My grandfather had been right. Authority reveals itself in how systems bend quietly. At home, the tension thickened. My father called again and said this could get ugly. My mother sent a message saying she was worried about my future. Ethan texted, "Do not disappear on us now." I did not disappear. I simply stopped complying. I did not argue. I did not explain. I let the silence do its work. Inside, I repeated a lesson I had learned early in service. When everything around you is loud, slow down. When chaos increases, narrow your focus. In my unit, I had learned how to keep steady when things broke down. At home, I was learning how to keep steady when the people who were supposed to protect you chose to pressure you instead. The contrast was stark. In uniform, people respected boundaries because they understood consequences. In my family, boundaries were treated as betrayal. The day before the next required step, my father left a voicemail that sounded almost desperate. "Kaya, we need to fix this. Just sign the paper and we can move on." My mother followed with a message saying, "If you do not come tonight, do not bother coming at all." Ethan sent one last line saying, "Talk now or regret it later." I sat on my couch with the phone face down and counted my breaths. The orders were clear. The timeline was set. The pressure from my family was peaking, and that meant the system was about to respond. I thought about my grandfather standing in the doorway of his garage years ago, telling me that calm is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move anyway. I picked up my phone and sent a single message saying I would not be available. No explanation, no apology. The silence that followed was loud. If you were in Kaya's place, what would you do right now? Tell the truth, or wait one more step? Comment, talk, or wait. The event at Fort Cavazos was not dramatic in the way people imagine power revealing itself. There were no banners, no music, no applause waiting to happen. It was a briefing followed by a short ceremony held in a long rectangular room with flags placed precisely and rows of chairs aligned with almost uncomfortable symmetry. Veterans filled most of the seats wearing subdued expressions and jackets that carried history without advertising it. A long table stood at the front with name placards placed carefully in advance. There were rules in the room and everyone felt them, even if they could not name them. My family arrived early because they wanted to be seen. My father wore the same suit he reserved for events where he expected recognition. My mother adjusted his collar twice and scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone searching for advantage. Ethan walked a step ahead of them, already rehearsing introductions that had not been requested. I arrived alone and took a seat near the back without drawing attention. No one introduced me and no one needed to. I carried myself the way I always did when entering a space that required restraint. I was not there to be noticed. I was there to be present. The room settled into quiet conversation as people waited. My mother whispered something to Ethan, and he nodded, looking pleased with himself. My father glanced in my direction, once then looked away as if reassured that I was exactly where he expected me to be. When the door at the front opened, the room adjusted instinctively. Chairs straightened, backs aligned, and conversations stopped mid-sentence. A senior officer entered with a measured pace and surveyed the room without expression. He did not raise his voice when he spoke, and he did not need to. "We will wait for Kaya Hale to take her seat." The sentence landed with weight because it did not ask and it did not explain. It assumed compliance. The shift in the room was immediate and visible. People turned in their seats, scanning for me and then stepping aside as I stood. My father froze. My mother's hand tightened on her purse. Ethan looked around as if expecting someone else to answer to that name. I walked forward, feeling every step not as a spotlight, but as alignment. When I reached the table, a folder was placed in front of me without ceremony. The officer nodded once and asked me to confirm the documents. I opened the folder and recognized the forms I had verified days earlier. I confirmed them calmly. The officer thanked me and addressed the room. "We will proceed." My family did not sit down. They did not know whether to move or speak. My father tried first clearing his throat and stepping forward half a pace. "Excuse me," he said, "I am her father." The officer did not look at him. "Sir, you are not on the list." The words were polite and final. My mother reached for my arm, instinctively pulling at my sleeve. "We need a moment," she said. A staff member stepped between us with practiced ease. "Do not interfere, Mom." The tone was neutral, but firm. Ethan laughed nervously and said there must be some mistake. The officer finally looked in his direction and said nothing. Silence filled the space, and it did the work words would have softened. The briefing continued. Questions were directed to me, and I answered only what was asked. When confirmation was required, I gave it. When signatures were needed, they were mine. I spoke clearly and briefly, no explanations, no justifications. I could feel my family unraveling behind me, but I did not turn around. I thought about how often at home my voice had been dismissed before it could finish a sentence. Here it was measured and weighed. The irony was not lost on me. It was almost funny how they only listened when rank stood beside me. The ceremony concluded without flourish. People filed out with nods of recognition that carried respect, not curiosity. My father stood rooted as if the floor had shifted beneath him. My mother whispered my name with urgency I had never heard before. Ethan stared at the table where my name placard rested as if it might disappear if he looked away. When I stood to leave, the officer met my eyes and gave a slight nod. That was all. As I walked past my family, my father reached out again and stopped himself. The rules of the room had finally registered. Outside, the air felt cooler, and the noise of the bass settled back into its usual rhythm. My mother hurried after me and said, "Kaya, we need to talk now." I turned to face her and saw fear behind her insistence. Not concern, not pride, fear of losing control. "There is nothing to discuss," I said. She opened her mouth and my father cut in, telling her to stop. Ethan looked at me and said, "You did this on purpose." I considered correcting him but decided against it. The system had spoken more clearly than I ever could. Behind us, the building doors closed and the sound echoed in a way that felt symbolic without trying to be. I walked away with my posture unchanged. The room behind me would remember the sentence that had shifted everything. If you have ever seen a single line change an entire room press, like if you understand that feeling. After the exposure at Fort Cavazos, the panic set in quickly and without dignity. It did not arrive as anger first. It arrived as confusion and then calculation. My father called the next morning and asked if we could talk like adults. The phrase sounded reasonable until you heard what followed. He suggested we sit down and align on next steps so nothing slipped out of their control. My mother texted separately, saying she was worried about me and only wanted to protect me from making mistakes. The concern was familiar and hollow. Ethan waited until that evening to reach out saying family is family, and this did not need to become a thing. I listened to each message without responding and noticed how none of them asked what I wanted. They asked what I planned to do and how it would affect them. When I finally agreed to meet, it was not at their house. It was at a neutral place where conversations stayed civil because walls had ears. They arrived early again. My father tried to take the seat across from me as if positioning still mattered. My mother opened with concern layered over accusation. "I only want what is best for you," she said. "You know that. You have always been sensitive." My father leaned in and said, "We can handle this together. You do not have to carry everything yourself." The implication was clear. "Let us back in." Ethan smiled and said, "Come on, Kaya, we are family. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." I waited until they finished speaking, because interruptions only invite arguments. When I spoke, my voice stayed level. I said there would be no signatures from me on any documents related to the estate. My father started to object, and I raised a hand slightly, not to silence him but to set a boundary. I said there would be no authorization granted to Ethan now or later. I said all matters would proceed according to established process, with the appropriate responsible parties. My mother frowned and said, "You are pushing us away." I told her I was setting terms. Ethan scoffed and said, "You cannot do that." I looked at him and said I already had. The room went quiet. My father tried again, shifting to a tone he probably used in boardrooms. "Think about optics," he said. "Think about the family name." I thought about the funeral and the laughter and the assumption that I would absorb it. I said my decisions were not negotiable. The justice was not dramatic and it was not destructive. It was precise. They would not lose everything. They would lose the ability to use me. There would be no favors, no quiet fixes, no borrowed authority. When my mother accused me of punishing them, I corrected her. "I am restoring what was taken," I said. Ethan laughed nervously and said, "You cannot be serious about making us apologize." I told him I was. Not in private, not with excuses, publicly and clearly. I specified where and how. A statement acknowledging the disrespect shown at the funeral and correcting the narrative they had allowed to stand. On the platforms where they had built their image, the church group, the veterans' circle, the social pages they curated carefully. My father's face hardened. "That is unnecessary," he said. I shook my head. It is necessary. Not for me to feel better, but for the truth to exist where the lie was allowed to live. My mother accused me of humiliating them. I pointed out that they had already done that themselves. Ethan muttered that this was overkill. I told him this was the cost of accountability. The meeting ended without resolution because they needed time to understand that pleading would not change terms. Over the next days, the messages came faster and softer. My mother sent long notes about love and family. My father warned about consequences that never materialized. Ethan tried humor again and then silence. When the apology finally appeared, it was stiff and carefully worded, but it was public. People noticed. Some asked questions. Some expressed surprise. The correction spread quietly. That was enough. I did not celebrate. I simply noted the shift. Justice does not always require destruction. Sometimes it requires subtraction. When I walked away, I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because the weight they had placed on me was no longer mine to carry. What followed did not feel like victory in the way movies teach people to expect it. There was no surge of satisfaction and no urge to replay the moment over and over. What settled instead was a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes when you finally stop bracing for impact. I did not win with money or with applause or with power taken from someone else. I won with self-worth protocol and a line that would not move again. For the first time in years, my phone was quiet for the right reasons. My family still existed in my life, but at a distance defined by terms, not convenience. We spoke when it mattered and not when control was the goal. I did not cut them off completely because cutting off is easy, and boundaries are not. Boundaries require repetition and patience and the willingness to be misunderstood. They tested those boundaries more than once. Old habits do not disappear overnight, but the pattern had changed and they felt it. At work, nothing dramatic happened. I returned to routine because routine is where respect lives. I followed procedure, I showed up prepared, I spoke when required and listened when needed. People treated me the same way they had before, except now there was no question about where I stood. Authority had done its work and stepped back. That was always the point. At home in the evenings, I moved through small rituals that grounded me. I placed my uniform where it belonged and changed into clothes that carried no rank. I brewed coffee and let the smell fill the kitchen the way my grandfather used to when he wanted a conversation to slow down. I kept his photo on the counter not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder of instruction. He had taught me that in some families, silence is mistaken for consent. I had lived that truth longer than I realized. I had also learned that respect is not loud. It is consistent. It shows up the same way every time without needing to announce itself. The hardest rank to earn is being taken seriously at your own table. I earned it not by raising my voice but by refusing to lower my standards. My family eventually adjusted. My mother learned to ask instead of assume. My father stopped framing conversations as directives. Ethan stayed distant, and that was acceptable. Distance is sometimes the healthiest form of honesty. We existed in parallel rather than collision, and that was enough. The peace I found was conditional, and that was intentional. It depended on boundaries being honored and process being followed. When those conditions were met, the relationship held. When they were not, it paused. That balance felt fair. On quiet mornings, I thought about how many people like me carry weight without recognition. People who keep systems running and families functioning without ever being asked how much it costs them. People who learn early that being dependable makes you invisible. I hoped that if my story reached someone like that, they would recognize themselves and understand that restraint is not weakness, and patience is not permission. There is dignity in waiting, and there is power in choosing when to stop. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug. I picked up my bag and headed out to another ordinary day. Nothing about it looked impressive from the outside, and that was exactly how I wanted it. If you have ever been the one holding everything together in silence, leave a line in the comments. Someone here will read it.